We'll go next to one of scores of young people that Richard mentored, and it's to Kevin Clancy from the CSBSJU corner of the banquet hall. Kevin Clancy.
Thank you, Fred. And wow, is it an honor to be speaking here this evening. My name is Kevin Clancy, and I'm the Assistant Dean of Experiential Learning at St. Ben's and St. John's. But I got to this role because of Richard. And I need to start off with when I first met Richard, which was in a Chinese history course. And admittedly, it wasn't an interest in Chinese history that necessarily motivated me to take this course, but it was more motivation of I needed 4 history credits in order to graduate from St. Ben's St. John's. And so I thought this would be a way to do it. And so I took this class, and what surprised me was that it was one of the best courses I took during my time at St. Ben's and St. John's. And it was one of the best courses partially because of Richard's deep history and understanding of China. The Taiping Rebellion was mentioned, and so we went there. But at the same time, Richard also created a community of learners and encouraged the students to grapple with the history and ask, what does that mean for them? And so because of this experience, I decided to take another course and added an Asian Studies minor to my degree. And one of the threads that ran through all of the courses and Asian Studies was that in all of these situations, Richard continued to create this community of learners and ask people to come together to think about how their own experience and their own histories connect with the histories that he was teaching. And it wasn't uncommon that there were students, of course, from Minnesota and the greater Midwest, but we also had international students from China and Japan who felt like they had a welcome voice in Richard's courses and were able to join the conversation. The other thread that connected the courses and the Asian Studies program was experiential learning. Richard wanted to be sure that students took their learning outside of the classroom and were able to see what was happening outside of the classroom, whether that meant joining an Asian club or creating an Asia club or going on study abroad. In all of these cases, Richard was very interested in making sure that learning was happening outside of the classroom. And I think it's important to note that while I accidentally fell into the Asian Studies program, due to Richard's vision and belief in Asian Studies, it grew into quite a large program to the point that students, subsequent students, were to come to St. Ben's and St. John's because of the Asian Studies program. And so when you talk about the vision, it's certainly something that we experienced too at St. Ben's and St. John's. And in the middle of central Minnesota, there's this large dynamic program. And the story, if the story ended there, it would already be a good story about a mentor and a professor who inspired students and created this large, impressive program in Minnesota. But the story doesn't end there because Richard was also very concerned that the learning didn't end at the end of the 4 years of college, but that it continued. And he also inspired many of us to go and to teach in Japan or teach in China. And so because of Richard's encouragement, I went with a number of students from St. Ben's and St. John's, as well as Father Bohr, to teach English in China through the Maryknoll program. And Richard continued to stay in touch with us, and so that when we would come back to the US, he would invite us to his classes to tell students what we had learned in China, or he would take us to the Peking Garden, another location at that time, out to lunch, to learn. And this was a scholar of the Taiping Rebellion who was interested to hear from us and what our experience was in China. And so Richard continued to keep that connection. The other thing that I had the great pleasure of working with Richard on was that we created a short-term study tour in southern China, where in St. Ben, St. John, students would go to China and see China through the lens of the Pearl River Delta. And so Richard even served as the faculty director one year and flew over and got on a rickety bus with 15 students in Guangzhou and went down the coast to Guangdong to only get on a rickety boat to go across from the Zhanjiang Peninsula to Hainan, because he believed in experiential learning so much that he himself lived that learning too. And I think Richard's impact on students was evidenced by the fact of about 10 years ago now, a group of students rented a space similar to this to have a retirement celebration for Richard with some of the students. And there were dozens of students there. And while I have the honor of speaking here tonight, my story isn't unique. because as you would go through this group of students, you would hear time and time again, not only what a great professor Richard was to them, but what an amazing mentor he continued to be even after they left St. Ben's and St. John's. And so when I think back to that original Chinese history class, we of course learned about Chinese dynasties. And one of the dynasties was the Tang Dynasty, which is widely considered to be the height of the Chinese golden era of culture and art. And I'd like to suggest to all of you here this evening that there is a Boer dynasty that occurred at St. Ben's and St. John's, which was truly the height of learning and culture through the Asian studies at St. Ben's and St. John's. And for those of us who are lucky enough to be part and to be connected to that Boer dynasty, as dynasties do, Richard's impact has continued to influence his generations of students who, hopefully in their own humble and unique ways, have tried to connect to the larger world and tried to build bridges outside of the space that they're in. And so, if you would, I'm wondering if you could grab what glass is in front of you, and I'd like to raise a toast to the first 80 years of the Boer dynasty, and many more years to come.
Thank you, Kevin.